Teresa Reed. It's very nice to see all of you. Welcome. I'm the chair of the Washtenaw County Democratic Party. We are thrilled that you're here for this really important and obviously time critical conversation. Data centers are in the news several times a day. There's a lot of misinformation out there about data center development. So we are so happy that you're joining us for this attempt to really try to, oh my God, that's so funny. Sorry, I forgot to mute my own phone. So, so we're really glad that you're here to join us for what we hope we know will be actually a very informative program. I want to thank our guests, Peter Sinclair, guest experts, Peter Sinclair, Ben Poulsen, Amanda Robert, and Missy Stultz. We're so happy that you're here. And also behind the scenes, Eli Nathans, who is a co-chair of our Washtenaw County Democratic Party's program committee, who's been really helpful. Peter and Ben have all been in on the organization of the meeting as well, along with Sharon Simonton and who is our co-chair of membership, and Leah Gillen, who is an indispensable volunteer. And as always, Jim Russo, who's wearing the headphones over there, who manages, technology at all of our meetings. So thank you very much. I'm turning it over to Eli Nathans, who is ready to roll. Thank you, Eli.
Thank you very much, Teresa. The Washtenaw Dems programs usually take place on the first Saturday of the month. Past programs are available on video through the Washtenaw Dems website. This meeting also will be recorded and will be made available on the website in a few days. In election years, we don't have enough time on Saturday mornings to cover all the subjects that we'd like to cover, and that's the reason this meeting is taking place at the time that it is. And if everyone could mute so we don't have noise in the background, that'd be great. I should say, in terms of the protocol for muting, participants are muted. They can ask questions through chat. The co-host, the panelists, can unmute themselves. That will prevent disturbance during the meeting as kind of phones go off, dogs bark, that kind of thing. MLive reports that 51 local governments in Michigan have passed moratoria on the development of data centers. This reflects a widespread desire to learn more about whether data centers will damage the environment, raise the cost of energy to consumers, cause harm to people who live in the vicinity, among other subjects, before any more are approved, if any more are approved. This public forum is designed to answer some of those questions. The first speaker will be Peter Sinclair. He's a Michigan-based environmental activist who for 20 years has produced evidence-based videos that have educated millions of Americans about scientific evidence for climate change, as well as practical clean energy options. Peter will discuss the larger context, what costs and burdens data centers impose, as well as possible benefits they bring. The second speaker is Amanda Robert, the network director at the Michigan Climate Action Network. Amanda has helped create a statewide movement for climate justice and community-centered responses to climate change. She has focused recently on the impacts of large data center development and will speak about the experience of communities in Michigan. The third speaker is Ben Poulsen, who's the State Government Affairs Director of the Michigan League of Conservation Voters. And I should say the Michigan League of Conservation Voters is the co-sponsor of this panel, this program, and I thank him very much for his help. He's an expert on regulation of data centers, and he's going to speak about the rules that Michigan has created to prevent, to the extent possible, harm caused by data centers, as well as the policies that the Public Service Commission has adopted to make sure that data centers' demand for energy does not raise the cost of energy for others, and also focuses on renewable sources of energy. The final speaker will be Dr. Missy Stultz, who's the Sustainability and Innovations Director for Ann Arbor. She helps the city and its residents achieve a just transition to carbon neutrality. Missy is going to sketch the ways in which data center development might take place with fewer burdens, sort of an outside the box analysis of this challenge that we all face. Following the speakers' presentations, there will be a chance for questions from the audience. I'd like to ask you to put the questions in chat as the speakers are speaking. I will copy what's in chat on an ongoing basis and then pose the questions after the 4 speakers have finished. That's the plan for the meeting. Without further ado, I'm going to thank you for coming and turn it over to Peter. Peter?
Okay, one moment. Okay. Something's happening. Let's try this again. Darn it. Okay. Okay. Everybody see a data center?
Yes.
Okay. So time is short. I'm going to race through this. I'll probably raise more questions than I answer, but just write your questions down and we'll try to handle them on the other end. Yeah, data centers are hitting us in a huge crunch, but hold the phone because a whole lot of the projections that we're seeing may not be coming to pass. Bloomberg recently reported that more than half of U.S. data centers planned for this year are expected to be delayed due to shortages of electrical equipment, confusion and resulting from the tariffs, and also the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, which is affecting supply chains all over the planet. People are concerned about data centers adding to electrical loads and possibly forcing prices up. That's certainly been reported around the country, but it is not necessarily an absolute with every situation in every state. So in this graph from the Lawrence Berkeley Lab, which was published recently, what you have here is from left to right is load growth or increased electrical demand. From bottom to top is the price of electricity. The blue dots are states. And what you see is there are some states that are having a lot of load growth, but are having lower rates over the last 5 years. And there are some states which have less load growth, but have higher prices. So adding data center is not necessarily a one-to-one relationship with higher electric prices. Over the last 5 years, and we're talking 2019 to 2024, states with the highest load growth generally saw retail prices decline. Those states where load decline tended to have price increases. Greater load means more customers to pay for fixed costs, so it can have a downward pressure on rates, ideally. However, higher growth can increase prices if there is a constraint in the system somewhere in terms of either supply or delivery, generation or transmission. I'm going to introduce you to Jigar Shah. Jigar is well known in the energy space. He was director of the $400 billion loan program, Department of Energy under Joe Biden. Long history in the renewable space. He's got several podcasts that I highly advise you listen to. He's going to describe here one of the horror stories of data center lore and the reason why a lot of data center developers are drawing the wrong lessons from this recent project initiated by Elon Musk.
Our friend Elon Musk, not really our friend, but has turned on a data center in record time. It was like 22 days or whatever it was in Memphis, right? Using basically, natural gas generators, and then connected it to the grid, and then put in a bunch of Tesla Megapacks. But it has somehow convinced the entire state of California and all of the Silicon Valley bros that you can run a data center off grid. Like, what the hell? It never ceases to amaze me that in the energy space, people make decisions all the time without doing any due diligence, right? And it's just shocking to me. Like, when you think about how much natural gas pipeline capacity we have in our country and how much of it can be firm, it's minuscule, right? Like if you build a natural gas plant in Ohio and then you say, I would like firm 8,760 hour access to that gas from that pipeline, that doesn't exist.
Yeah, right.
And it's 5 to 7 years to upgrade that natural gas pipeline, right? I just think that like they're going out and buying a bunch of solar turbines, right? Saying the natural gas grid is so robust, right? Fantastic. You do you, man. Like, I have like an engineering degree. I can read stuff. You don't. You went to Mar-a-Lago and paid $250,000, sat next to the wrong guy and got lied to. I get it, man. You do you. But like, it doesn't work, right? Like, it just doesn't work. And everybody wants it to work. And then they want to use the grid as backup, right? Then they want to say, well, don't worry. If something goes wrong with our natural gas, system, we've got this grid and it's going to catch up. No, we don't, right? The grid does not want to back you up. If you're going to be so bold as to say, I can build this thing off grid, go with God. Go do it off grid and come back to me crying in your milk when you can't make it work, right?
So what Jigger's discussing is the idea that a lot of the tech bros have that if they can't get a grid connection to meet their timetable, that they're all going to just buy a bunch of these gas turbines, do like Elon Musk did, pull them up on trailers behind a warehouse and power their own data center behind the meter, as they say. And Jigger's outlining the reasons why that is, for a variety of reasons, just not going to work. Now, here in Michigan, this data center near Saline, which has gotten a lot of controversy, is going to be connected to the grid and potentially could be applying a downward pressure on rates by more efficiently using our excess capacity. Recently, Public Service Commission regulators signed a contract with DTE and Oracle that includes a number of additional mandatory safeguards on this facility, which I think are useful to know about. First of all, a minimum contract duration of 19 years compared to the standard agreement of 5 years. So difficult for anybody to walk away and leave ratepayers holding any kind of a bag. We'll have to pay a minimum of 80% of the contracted electricity use, even if their usage is lower. So we have a pretty good idea of how much revenue they're going to be paying into the system. And if for any reason the facility stops operating, there is a termination payment or penalty of up to 10 years worth of minimum billing. So these all sound like good ideas. There's a number of other ones in this agreement. And I think what should happen is these should be formally introduced as legislation. So it's more than just an agreement with a regulatory body, but actually in a statute. These are two of our public service commissioners, Catherine Peritic and Dan Scripps, who's the chairman. And they are going to describe a very significant part of this agreement, which has Oracle, the data center developer, who will be providing for the Michigan ratepayers a very significant chunk of the energy storage that is required under our climate goals. So at no cost to the ratepayers, we're going to get 1.4 gigawatts of very desperately needed energy storage.
The customer is almost 1.4 gigawatts. So a lot of energy. That's a lot of capacity. And what was agreed to between DTE and Oracle is that an additional 1.4 gigawatts, so matching the size of the data center, of energy storage. So these are 4-hour lithium-ion batteries, would be built across the state to provide additional capacity to be able to make sure that this load can be served at the times of highest usage of the electric grid. So this storage is built, owned, and operated by DTE, but paid for by Oracle.
Just over 2 years ago, the legislature enacted a set of reforms at the end of 2023, and one of those was a storage target of 2,500 megawatts statewide by 2030. It was the first storage target in the Midwest, one of the first in the country, and one of the most ambitious in the country. And I think you can get hung up on, gigawatts and megawatts and everything else, but to just put it in terms of comparison to what the law requires as we get to the end of the decade, this contract on its own, again, paid for by the customer, gets us more than halfway to that statewide target. And so it really, I think, ups the level of ambition. And storage plays all sorts of roles. It's been said that it's the bacon of the energy system. It just makes everything better. And so when you think about what that means in terms of reliability, in terms of driving down prices, in terms of the ability to integrate renewable energy resources or add more nuclear to the system, storage helps with all of that. And getting more than 50% to our statewide goal with one contract paid for by a third party and not by the other customers across the state, that's a huge benefit to Michigan.
Okay, so another big player in this space is Google, and it turns out that Michigan and Minnesota seem to be doing a pretty decent job in reining these things in. And this Washington Post article is talking about a Google data center called Pine Island that is in Minnesota. And one of the things they're going to be doing, similar to what Oracle is doing in Michigan, they are providing a virtual power plant program that will be part of 1,900 megawatts of new clean energy capacity to power that facility. That means that all the new electricity that data centers will demand could theoretically come from upgrading homes with smart appliances, heat pumps, and batteries, and operating them as virtual power plants. We can talk about that in Q&A. Similar deal taking place in Detroit, Van Buren Township, where Google is working on a data center project, and they commit to fully cover the cost of 1,600 megawatts of new renewable energy, mostly solar, I think, plus an additional 480 megawatts of battery storage. And no new fossil fuel plants would be built or expanded to serve that facility. So this is very positive that we're pushing these developers to not only abide by, but actually add to Michigan's climate goals. Finally, I want to acquaint people with some of the very rapidly changing technology, which kind of points to a future where these enormous big box data centers may very well be a much smaller part of the picture than what we're seeing today.
SPAN is now making small fractional data centers, or they call them nodes, that can be put on the side of residential homes. The idea is to take advantage of unused electrical capacity on local grids, which the SPAN smart panels can find. Now, a network of these nodes talking to each other across the country is about the equivalent of a mid-sized traditional data center. So these could negate the need to build as many. Hyperscalers and AI cloud providers just tap into the node network like a regular data center. Now, SPAN collaborated with NVIDIA using its technology in the system. SPAN claims it can install 8,000 of these units about 6 times faster and at 5 times lower cost than the construction of a typical centralized 100 megawatt data center of the same size. Now, Pulte Homes is in the early testing phase with these systems, which they have already deployed in a handful of communities. Now, why would a homeowner want this? Well, because they would just have to pay one flat fee for electrical and Wi-Fi, which SPAN said would be roughly $150 total. So a lot less than everybody's normal electric bills.
Okay, and finally, we haven't talked about water, but the Saline Data Center is going to be having a closed loop cooling system, which hopefully would uh, minimize the water impact locally on that system. And this is Sean McBrearty appearing on WKAR. He's director of Michigan Clean Water Action. And I think I agree with almost everything he says here in terms of what can be done with data centers.
And the thing about data centers, the thing that I keep coming back to is, this doesn't have to be an environmental problem. The fact that it is poised to be an environmental and affordability problem are choices that we're making. There's no reason why these can't be powered with renewables on site. There's no reason that these can't be cooled using technology that doesn't use massive amounts of water or pollute our water. We can make choices to regulate data centers responsibly and turn this into something that's no longer an issue, make this a benefit for our communities instead of a tax on regular folks.
Yeah, I would only say that renewable energy on site is probably not going to be practical in most cases in Michigan, but the fact that these players are purchasing large amounts of renewable energy and storage is certainly, I believe, the way we should go. So that's my piece for now. And I'll be available hopefully in the Q&A part if anybody has any follow-ups.
Thank you so much, Peter, and thank you for sticking to the 15-minute limit. That was perfect. Amanda Robert.
Thank you. Let me see if I can share my screen. Okay, everybody can see my screen, hopefully.
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you again for inviting me tonight and to everybody that is here attending. I'm speaking today from the perspective of grassroots organizers and communities from across Michigan that are already grappling with proposed hyperscale data center development and what it could mean for their future. As mentioned, I am the network director of the Michigan Climate Action Network, and we are a statewide network of nearly 190 organizations and more than 20,000 individual members all across the state, everyone working towards climate action. And we hear regularly from communities in every region of the state about the challenges they are facing. And lately that has included a lot about rapid expansion of proposed data center development. So I think it's important to begin the conversation by recognizing that conversations about data centers are often framed primarily as discussions about innovation, investment, economic development, technological advancement, and the future of artificial intelligence. But for residents, that is not how the projects are really experienced. And so for communities and residents, they experience the proposals that could fundamentally reshape their communities through major land use changes, new energy infrastructure, increased water demand, changes to local development patterns, and long-term impacts that may last for decades. And residents feel like these projects are moving much faster than the public conversations happening around them. Across Michigan, this is not an isolated issue involving one or two communities. In Saline Township, we've seen concerns about transparency, utility agreements, and local decision-making generated significant public controversy. Residents raised concerns about the ex parte agreement involving utility infrastructure, and after local officials voted against aspects of the proposal, the developer filed suit against the township. In Lyon Township, residents are currently engaged in an active debate over a proposed hyperscale data center development. Community members have raised concerns about water use, energy demand, traffic, noise, and long-term impacts, while local officials have faced pressure and the possibility of litigation from the developer. And those are not the only communities grappling with these questions. We have seen communities organizing all across the state. Altogether, there are roughly 20 or 30 large-scale data center proposals and projects in some stage of development across Michigan. What that tells me is this is not a series of isolated local disputes. It is a statewide pattern of development that is unfolding rapidly across many different kinds of communities. One of the strongest themes I hear is not actually about technology at all. It is about trust. People often feel they are reacting to decisions rather than participating in shaping them. In some areas, residents have discovered that proposals had already advanced through planning commissions or early approval processes before the broader community was even made aware. In many cases, negotiations, land agreements, or utility discussions are already underway before meaningful public engagement begins. Sometimes those discussions occur under non-disclosure agreements or through processes that feel inaccessible to the public. That creates deep trust issues and a broader feeling that major decisions affecting a community are being shaped through backroom deals rather than open democratic engagement. And when communities raise concerns, they sometimes face threats of litigation from developers, as I just talked about a few moments ago. That only reinforces the perception that local residents are being asked to accept decisions rather than asked to help shape them. And I think that distinction matters enormously. There is a major difference between informing the public about a project and meaningfully engaging the public in decisions that could permanently alter their community. Beyond those process concerns, residents are also asking practical questions about impacts. They are asking about water, they are asking about energy, and they are asking about air quality. Excuse me. They're asking about traffic, noise, and the scale of construction activity these projects can bring. Because these projects are not your typical construction projects. Many involve years of infrastructure work, utility upgrades, heavy equipment, truck traffic, and significant changes to the surrounding landscape. One concern that deserves particular attention is air quality. Developers often describe backup generation systems as emergency equipment that is rarely used. But communities around the country have already seen situations where on-site fossil fuel generation became a much larger part of the conversation. As many of us have heard, in Memphis, Tennessee, residents and environmental justice advocates raised concerns after a large number of gas turbines were brought in to support the AI-related operations. The controversy sparked broader debates about emissions, permitting, public health impacts, and environmental justice. Whether or not Michigan communities ultimately face situations like Memphis, the example illustrates why residents are asking questions now rather than after the facilities are built. They want to know what equipment will be on site, how often it may operate, what emissions are associated with it, and how those impacts interact with existing air quality burdens. And of course, water is another major concern. We are Michigan, after all. Residents want to know how much water these facilities will use, where that water will come from, and what impacts the demand could have on their local systems over time. They are asking questions about both municipal water supplies and groundwater resources. And they are paying attention to examples from around the country. In parts of Texas and the broader Southwest, we've seen communities already grappling with whether large-scale data center expansion is compatible with long-term water availability and regional water stress. And of course, Michigan is fortunate to have abundant freshwater resources, but that does not mean we should avoid asking questions about cumulative demand, local infrastructure capacity, or how our water resources are managed. And of course, communities are also asking questions about cooling systems. Like we heard about Saline, many facilities will use closed-loop systems that can reduce water withdrawals, which is great. But residents want transparency about what chemicals could be used and how those systems are maintained. What safeguards exist to protect groundwater and surface water? And communities already dealing with contamination from things like PFAS and other water quality concerns, those questions are especially important. So that brings me into cumulative impacts. Communities do not experience these projects one at a time. They experience them in the context of everything else that already exists. So new energy infrastructure is layered on top of already existing infrastructure. And new water demand is layered on top of already existing water demand. New emission sources are layered on top of existing environmental burdens. And communities that are already dealing with industrial pollution, transportation corridors, legacy contamination, or other environmental challenges often experience these additional impacts differently than communities that are not. That is why cumulative impacts matter. They help us understand the full picture rather than evaluating each project in isolation. And of course, that brings me to the broader climate implications. Even as individual facilities become more efficient, total energy demand associated with data center growth continues to increase. Facility by facility analysis can miss the larger picture. The question is not simply whether one facility is more efficient than the other. The question is whether the overall trajectory of growth aligns with our climate goals, resource constraints, and long-term public interest. I also believe it's very important that we question assumptions about inevitability. There is a growing narrative nationally that rapid hyperscale expansion is simply unavoidable because of AI and digital growth. But projected demand is not a force of nature. It is shaped by corporate decisions, market incentives, policy choices, and infrastructure planning decisions. The rapid growth of AI-related data center development is, in many ways, still speculative. It is being driven by aggressive forecasts, competitive investment cycles, and technology that is evolving very quickly. Even Bill Gates has acknowledged the possibility that companies could spend billions building infrastructure based on demand projections that ultimately do not materialize. And if those projections are wrong, communities may still be left living with the long-term consequences of land use changes, energy infrastructure expansion, water demand, and altered development patterns long after the investment cycles shift elsewhere. That is one reason communities and public institutions should feel empowered to ask hard questions about scale, necessity, cumulative impacts, and long-term public benefits before major infrastructure decisions become locked in. Excuse me. It is also one reason we are seeing so many communities adopt or consider moratoria just being the plural of moratorium. Those moratoria are often misunderstood. Most communities are not saying no to technology. They are asking for time to gather information, time to understand consequences, time to determine whether existing regulatory structures are sufficient for projects of this scale. So while I'm not the one being asked tonight to design policy solutions, I do want to just briefly acknowledge some of the approaches that communities across Michigan are raising most often. So those include strong transparency and disclosure requirements around energy and water use, as well as water discharge and chemicals used in cooling systems. Communities are also raising concerns about the use of non-disclosure agreements and local negotiations, and whether tax incentives should be offered to large-scale technology developers without clear, enforceable public benefit. And one of the best ideas I've heard came from organizers from Virginia with a group called Young, Gifted, and Green. And that is the creation of standardized and enforceable community benefits through local ordinances or state law. At the core of many of these suggestions is a simple idea. If communities are expected to meaningfully participate in these decisions, then that participation needs to be real, transparent, and enforceable. And that brings me to what I believe is the most important question of all. The issues bringing people together from very different backgrounds and ideology all over the state and country are not simply the issues of water, energy, traffic, air quality, or even climate change. It is whether communities have a meaningful voice in decisions that will shape their future. Do residents and local elected officials actually have a say in what happens to their communities? Or is that decision ultimately being made elsewhere? Because if communities cannot meaningfully say no, then community engagement risks becoming performative rather than truly participatory. And at the end of the day, communities are asking whether the processes used to approve projects of this scale are transparent, accountable, and democratic enough to deserve public trust. That is my whole thing. I will stop sharing.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Thank
and
you also
I
for-
want to just take a second to also add that we've created some resources at the Michigan Climate Action Network. And I think I have a colleague on. If not, I will drop them in the chat. We have a free course on data centers, so you learn all about the background and just all types of information there, kind of a clearinghouse of information on data centers, as well as we have an action. And so I'll throw this in the chat. So appreciate it.
Thank you. Ben Polson, you're next.
Thank you, and thank you all for having me. As I was putting together this presentation and working on my slides, I realized I don't think I could compete with Peter, and so hopefully I'm happy to share my policy knowledge and get us quickly to the discussion that is really valuable. I also realize that probably makes my face really big on everyone's screen. If I look a little bit worse than I did on the poster, that's because the poster picture was taken before I started working on data center policy. And this is kind of where I'm at now. Like was mentioned, I'm Ben Polson. I'm the State Government Affairs Director at Michigan LCV. If you're not familiar, Michigan League of Conservation Voters is a leading voice for our environment in state government. And we work to elect and hold accountable environmental champions at the state level. If you're familiar with us, for one thing, it's probably our legislative scorecard, where you can check how your state lawmakers are voting on important environmental and democracy issues, as well as track utility contributions. I certainly don't have all the answers, but I really wanted to join this conversation to bring two unique perspectives. One, as a member of the National Conservation Voters Movement, working alongside other state LCVs, I've had the opportunity to work with states like Tennessee, where we've seen, some terrible impacts, and Virginia, just being overwhelmed with data centers, as well as states advancing some solid data center policy. And so I wanted to be able to share that with you all. Also, Michigan LCV has long been engaged in the data center policy debate, and we worked very hard to fight for as many environmental protections in the sales and use tax breaks bill, which eventually passed last session. We also opposed the passage of that bill because we did not think it has sufficient protections for Michigan's environment. And so Michigan LCV is incredibly familiar with what does exist and where the very large gaps still are. If there is one thing that everyone takes away from this webinar, what I really hope that it is this, and that is that Michigan does not have a data center regulatory statute, and it needs one. Peter's mentioned some places where we do have regulation, but there's not an overarching regulatory bill. And this is really important because, as the other presenters have already mentioned, they are unique impacts, and these unique and unprecedented impacts deserve unique legislation. We do have existing tools, and some of those already mentioned have been large load tariffs, as well as project agreements from the Michigan Public Service Commission. There is also permitting process in EGLE for air permits, wetlands, stormwater impacts, as well as large water withdrawals. Local governments have the ability to zone on some issues that we've seen, such as noise, as well as development agreements that have been made. Additionally, like I mentioned, we have those tax incentives, and there are requirements to meet those tax incentives enforced by the Michigan Strategic Fund Board. And I think, we're blessed as Michiganders to live in a state with natural resources, and we do put a premium on those, and we do really work hard to try to protect those. And so when I talk to some of my colleagues in some of those other states, they're jealous of a large water withdrawal permitting system. That being said, there are a lot of gaps in these pieces. For example, our large water withdrawal permitting system doesn't have reporting requirements if a data center was getting their water through another permit, like a municipality. And our state auditor general has consistently found problems with reporting under that water withdrawal permitting system. Like Amanda mentioned, we have some air permitting requirements, but EGLE is specifically not allowed to consider cumulative impacts or environmental justice concerns. Local governments can do zoning regulations, but they are not written with data centers in mind. And so there's a lot that needs to be done in order to support those communities to update their zoning ordinances. And I think really importantly is the tax incentive requirements. You may have heard that the tax incentives require data centers to use 90% clean energy. And the way that is being interpreted is that if you have an agreement with a utility, then you're going to be considered contributing 90% clean energy. Many of our utility grids are not near 90% clean energy, and they're not going to be at 90% clean energy anytime soon. And in fact, large load growth is something that allows utilities to extend that deadline and push off the need to hit our climate goals. And so that's particularly concerning to the Michigan League of Conservation voters. We've talked a little bit about the development agreements already and what other developers are doing. But I think what's really important is that those shouldn't be wins that we're negotiating and hoping to hold them to. That should be the base level that the state is requiring, and not making communities try to seek these agreements one at a time. With all of those gaps, I think it's pretty clear why communities are hitting pause. Right? Local officials do not have enough information or state guidance to make decisions that are going to affect their communities for decades. I will say developers are making negotiated commitments, but also we've seen local governments give further tax breaks in order to hope to hold them to those commitments. And again, that shouldn't be the case. We should have a minimum consistent standard. Like I said, I work with a lot of other states. I wanted to mention Minnesota, which has been a leader in this space and has gotten a regulatory legislation passed and signed by their governor. There's some key parts of that. It applies to all data centers of 100 megawatts or more. It requires additional review of water efficiency measures for very large data centers. It instructs the Public Utilities Commission to create a separate rate class for data centers, as well as make sure they give explicit instruction to the Public Utilities Commission to make sure that data center impacts cannot interfere with their climate goals. I don't want to get bogged down in all of the different pieces. These bills are very long, but just saying is that there's a lot we could do. In Minnesota as well, the largest data centers contribute to a community benefits fund at $5 million per year, which is a significant and ongoing payment that they are willing to make into those communities. Another state that we've worked closely with is Washington, which is very interesting because they have big tech, and they also have a commitment to environmental considerations. And they spent a year going through a stakeholder process to develop strong model legislation. The legislation, unfortunately, did not pass. Microsoft came out strongly against it, and that was about the end of that in terms of Washington state discussion. But again, you'll see a fund the data centers pay into for low-income, energy-burdened households in order to help them with their energy assistance. I think another really interesting piece of that is data centers where it would be required to reduce their load capacity at periods of high stress. So we're not seeing other users face the impacts of those really high stress times where the grid might have blackouts. Data centers are required to curtail their energy first. There are stronger forecasting requirements in order to help with those overbuilding solutions. And I think what's really interesting is they went a step further from Minnesota. Instead of saying data centers can't interfere with our climate progress, data centers actually have to beat the rest of the grid on the climate progress, and setting earlier targets for what data centers must do for clean energy. A couple more states that I do just want to touch on. Maine did have the first moratorium on data centers, so it would have a 1-year pause. That was vetoed by their governor. And also in Vermont, some unique things that were done there was energy transformation payments directly to host communities, as well as support for virtual power plants written right into statute, kind of like some of the agreements that we have seen. Unfortunately, that legislation worked on by the conservation voters movement in Vermont was also vetoed by the governor. The last state that I want to touch on is Illinois. And the Illinois Power Act is a really exceptional piece of draft legislation that advocates are working hard to currently pass. And it contains many of the things that we've discussed that are in some of the voluntary agreements, that are the values we'd like to see the tax incentives actually capture. But it goes a step further in most ways. I think one of the big central concepts is data centers have to bring their own clean energy. And the amount of energy that could be curtailed in a grid emergency is equal to the amount of energy a data center is using that is not clean energy. If you build out clean energy that the whole grid can use, that's new and equitable, then you don't have to worry about that curtailment because you've supported the grid. But if you're relying on the utilities, then they're going to curtail that power when other customers need it. Importantly, the tariff protections extend beyond the Public Service Commission. We talked a little bit about the Public Service Commission tariffs, and we really have that for one service area and one particular project. I live in an area in Michigan where my utility is not regulated by the Public Service Commission. And so there's a lot that needs to be done to make sure that utilities like mine are protecting their ratepayers from data centers as well. Another really important thing from the Power Act is this environmental justice component. And it really centers these communities with environmental justice, gives them additional voice. We've seen with development and with power here in Michigan that certain communities have continuously faced the impacts of power generation and of build out. And so Illinois really recognizes that and gives them an additional voice and additional powers to say no. With all of those different examples, I think you could see some things that Michigan could really adopt. I would say, first of all, though, like Amanda has mentioned, the needs are not even around our air, our water, our energy usage, but really around transparency and community engagement. Communities deserve clear information before decisions are made. And this is projected energy usage, land impacts, tax inclinations, and economic benefits. There shouldn't be NDAs or rushed processes, and major decisions shouldn't be made without public information. That also means meaningful community engagement, ensuring that the communities have voices in these outcomes and not engagement after plans are already in motion. And then important for all of this is the need for the state to back up consistent standards. Local communities can negotiate benefit agreements, but if the state isn't backing up those benefit agreements, we're seeing what can be a race to the bottom as some governments are really attracted by the tax revenue implications and are fighting over these projects. if we have statewide standards on community benefits and these types of agreements, local communities can say, no, you will give us these things in order for these impacts you're bringing to the communities. And then I mentioned those are the first places, but yes, climate, affordability, water, and community investments are the other areas that are really important for policy. Data center growth should support and not undermine our climate investments. They can support investments in energy affordability, like investments in other people's homes and in our grid. Our water is not limitless, and it is not everywhere here in Michigan. Despite always being by a Great Lake, it might not always be by a sufficient groundwater aquifer. And so there is really need to update our water withdrawal programs, as well as transparency and reporting around water usage. And I think that is all I have. I want to get us quickly to those discussions because I'm sure people have many questions.
Thank you so much, Ben Poulsen. Again, Ben is the State Government Affairs Director at the Michigan League of Conservation Voters. Our last speaker is Missy Stoltz from Ann Arbor. Missy?
Thanks, Eli. And thanks to all of the other speakers. I'm going to go fast because I agree with almost everything that's been said. And I want to start by saying I'm about to share my personal views. I'm not an expert in this landscape. I am thinking about this like many of you are. And to me, I think there's two core issues that we're struggling with. And we've spent a lot of time on one of them, and that's around building and zoning. Right. And I think Peter set us up and Ben just elucidated a lot of great ideas where there could be opportunities with data centers. And oh boy, there could be real challenges if we don't catch our breath and think intentionally and purposefully about those opportunities. So whether that's investments in residential and commercial energy systems through virtual power plants, which Peter talked a little bit about, whether that's heat capture. I am actually incredibly interested in vertical data centers in something like my downtown area where I could capture all of the waste heat from those servers and power a downtown heating and cooling district, right? We could do very smart, useful things, but they won't happen magically. They will happen because we've caught our breath and thought about what our goals are and how we can incentivize. And I mean that not necessarily financially, but in conversations, incent people to do the right thing. And sometimes that incent is saying, if you want to be here, you will be here this way. And so I'm excited about the possibilities here. I love the conversations around investments in storage and grid resilience and reliability, especially at a time where most of us are living with a grid that is very old and antiquated. It needs massive investments. And there's opportunities here, I think, to invest perhaps not in the grid that we have, which while I am thankful for that grid is the grid of the last 100 years, perhaps we can rethink the grid of the future, one that is more decentralized, that has distributed power sources, more microgrids, more functionality that really helps us move into the future that we all need, one that is responsive to the climate crisis, both from a mitigation standpoint, but also from an adaptation and resilience standpoint. So I think there's a lot of opportunities here, and I think we have to go into these conversations very thoughtfully and understanding what our values are so we can bring them to the table. So I know we're spending a lot of time thinking about the building and zoning elements, and those are very, very visceral, and that's what we're hearing a lot about. I'm going to offer the second piece, which actually keeps me up a lot more at night, and that is how we use all of the data in our lives and how we're using AI. It's really easy to kind of put the blame on others, but we have to hold up a mirror and acknowledge the fact that we are using a lot of data and doing a lot of computation. And if you generated an image using AI this week at any point, you are contributing to this demand. That does not mean it is bad. That does not mean it is good. But we have to have some real conversations and critical thinking about how we use data and how we do computation and how we're stepping into the AI space and maybe why we shouldn't in certain cases be in that landscape. And in every discussion I am in, we've focused on what we focused on tonight. We haven't focused on a question about how we use data and how we use AI. And this makes me really nervous because I'm seeing people use it in place of critical thinking. And I think that's dangerous for society. So I'm not saying it's bad, but I'm saying we do have to hold a little mirror up to ourselves and ask how we are engaging in this topic. It is not enough to place that responsibility on someone else. So as I think about this, I fully agree with what Amanda said around transparency in our discussions. I think we do need to pause and catch our breath and understand what our values are and how we center those in a moment that could be an opportunity. But sans that opportunity will almost certainly have negative externalities we're not prepared for. And I think as we talk about engagement, I want to say yes, and yes, we need to engage in communities, but that engagement should not be just the responsibility of a data center. We need to be doing good engagement every single day with our constituents, because it's unrealistic to ask our constituents to be experts in energy systems, but it is absolutely appropriate to ask them to be experts in their lives and the situations that they're dealing with, and to center that in our solution seeking process. So I think we have a systematic problem around engagement that did not start in this discussion, but is being exacerbated in this discussion. So I hope that we can maybe recenter meaningful, sustained, deep, thoughtful engagement with our residents so that our values become clear, so we can walk into a transparent process with those values clearly articulated and get true community benefits. And with that, I'll stop. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So there have been about half a dozen questions posed in chat, actually a few more. I'm going to ask them in the order in which they were posed, except that I'm going to, if someone asks several questions, I'm going to move to someone else before I ask a second or third question from the same person. So the first question was from Eden Bloom, and I'd say whoever feels competent to answer should just jump in. Are there supply chain issues with the materials needed for battery energy storage systems? And if that is the case, are there policies in place to prevent the use of dirty generators if the battery energy storage systems don't come online in time? And are there other safety or noise issues with battery energy storage systems? So if any of the panelists would care to answer that question, just jump in.
I can jump in with a little bit. I would say, I mean, there are, throughout the energy system, we have supply chain problems. And what's interesting there is that when we're talking about data centers and how we can make sure that the costs aren't spread to other ratepayers, market costs are something that often gets left behind, where just increased demand is hard to legislate away. We have increased demand and we have higher prices. And I'll say, in terms of the use of dirty generators, right, we do have that tax breaks incentive. Now, no data center has yet been approved for those tax breaks, which is encouraging data centers to have a contract with a utility, so the power used by that data center would be as clean or as dirty as that utility's overall mix at the time.
Would anyone else care to add to that answer?
Well, let me just jump in. We're developing rapidly, increasing our ability to manufacture batteries here in the United States, and the newer technologies are becoming gradually less vulnerable to some of the shortages that we've seen in the past. Insofar as lithium and rare earths and things like that, although the current blockade of the Strait of Hormuz is holding up supply chains all over the planet. But just in the listening to the people in the industry, as I have pretty closely over the last several months, I haven't picked up on any great anxiety about our ability to crank out batteries. I think we're in pretty good shape in that regard. Thank you.
Any other panelists care to jump in on that one? All right, then I'm going to ask a question. Actually, it's from C. Fugalo. I'm not sure exactly how you pronounce your last name. If I mangled it, I apologize. And Sharon Simonton just posed a very similar question. So it is, will AI technologies be used to control the population as they are to a great extent in China right now, which has placed cameras in all sorts of places to keep track of the population? So in other words, this is a question about whether we really want to support the purposes for which these data centers are being created.
Yeah, I'll answer that at first and let others if they want to jump in. But I think it's an important point, and I'm never quite sure when it's appropriate to bring up, right? But Of course, we can't say what they'll be used for in that way, right? If they'll be used in the way that they're saying they're used in China, but I think we can look to the contracts that the current administration, federal administration is signing around surveillance that they're using AI for, or drones that AI is being used for, or surveillance specifically with ICE that they're using AI for, and understand that at least a significant portion of AI data centers could be used for an agenda we might not support.
Thank you. Anyone else care to jump in on that?
I just,
Go ahead, Ben.
one thing here, and I think it's really important, and Missy started bringing up, and when we talk about data centers, we're talking about a building and, or a campus or 250 acres, what have you, and talk about like how to regulate that building. That's a separate but very connected in how do we regulate AI, and both of those questions need to be addressed, and you can't ignore either of them. So it is a different question from how do we regulate the building, but also just as important.
I would just say I'm as freaked out about Skynet becoming sentient as everybody else probably is, and certainly the uses of AI are critically important considerations, which I sort of have compartmentalized and not really dealt with. But honestly, I would say the road to regulating AI starts in November, and I think people in this group probably should be hyper aware of that because we're less likely to see it under the current regime. Yeah, I'm all for regulating AI. I think it needs to be regulated. I view it as as significant a development as nuclear weapons. But in the meantime, if we can get Darth Vader to pay for our climate goals, I'm all for that. So we'll do what we can when we can.
Thank you very much. Any other panelists care to jump in on that one? Then I'm going to ask a question from Teresa Reed. First of all, could someone tell me what EGLE stands for?
The Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy.
Environment, Great Lakes and Energy. Okay. How is it possible that the Department of the Environment, Great Lakes and Energy is prohibited from considering cumulative impacts and environmental racism? And how can we fix that?
So this is something that's been worked on in the legislature for a long time. I think I see some colleagues who's been advocating for a change here in the list of participants. Senator Stephanie Chang has really been championing the Protecting Overburdened Communities Act. And I would encourage everyone to tell your state representative and state senator that change needs to be made. But it is not included in the law to look at those cumulative impacts, and it is an absolute detriment to our environment and our communities.
Thank you. Any other panelists care to add to that? Nope. Then I'll move on to the next question from somebody new. Let's see. This is from Deb A. Why are data centers given tax breaks? Other businesses don't get tax breaks. Anyone? You don't have to justify it. You just have to try it.
Actually, a lot of businesses do get tax breaks.
Yeah.
And the wisdom of giving data centers tax breaks is certainly be debated. And possibly if the vote on that happened, I think a couple of years ago, if that vote were taken again today, might very well have a different result. But data centers were maybe a little more cool. I mean, we knew less about them a couple of years ago. The general idea that they can, if handled properly, provide net benefits to the community, I think is still a good one. But like Ben mentioned, I think we need a much more comprehensive regulatory statute covering some of the downsides.
Thank you. Anyone else care to add?
Yeah, I think I'll just add that, like was mentioned, this was passed in 2024. And I think you'd have to ask the state legislature that passed it. And of course, can't blame one party or the other. This is a vote that was almost equal on party lines. When you count the governor's signature, it actually is equal. And so what I would say to look into is something we often talk about when we talk about utilities, these investor-owned utilities, and we can bring up technology companies as well, but it may have a thing or two to do with campaign contributions. And part of the reason why we all hopefully worked very hard on gathering signatures to get money out of politics.
Thank you. Anyone else? Nope. Then I'm going to pose a question from Rachel Barnett. Rachel refers to an experience in Georgia when people who live nearby a data center were forced to use bottled water because of the contamination of groundwater by a data center. Perhaps you're familiar with that instance. And she wants to know, how can we prevent something like that from happening in Michigan?
So I think the Georgia case is actually about water use, and that their taps were kind of running dry, and that's why they went to bottled water. But I think this is back to something many of us have mentioned, and those would be transparency and disclosure requirements around any kind of chemicals that would be used in cooling systems.
Anyone else? Okay. And Peter, I guess Peter addressed that to some extent. So I'm going to ask a question that just came in from Caroline Nathans. How would rejection of building data centers in a particular area affect the ability of people in the area to use AI, including for undesirable uses? So if you don't build data centers in Michigan, will that in any way prevent the kind of surveillance or other worrisome uses of AI that have been discussed? Or is that really, you can just draw on a data center in Ohio for that purpose? How is it going to affect Michiganders?
Well, yeah, I mean, restricting AI in a given location in Michigan is not going to turn back the industry. That's still going to evolve and develop. I think that part of the opportunity, and I'm thinking in terms of from a climate perspective, I would rather have a data center in Michigan that was underwriting a great deal of renewable energy and storage rather than a data center elsewhere that was running on, unregulated, dirty gas belching turbines without any awareness or consciousness of climate impacts. So I'm glad to see that other states like Minnesota and Illinois are being proactive on that, because we do have a role to play.
Local governments also cannot exclude data centers by right. That's exclusionary zoning, which is not allowed under the law. So the pause, I think, when we talk about moratoriums, is for folks to kind of figure out how and where and what they sort of want in a data center. It is not a yes/no question. That would be almost certainly illegal.
That's a really good point to make, and a lot of the misinformation that we see in terms of people's feelings about how data centers are being permitted oftentimes don't take into account exactly the zoning sort of considerations that you're mentioning here. And people just think if 100 of us show up at a meeting, surely the local boards will turn this down, when in fact, that may not be a legal pathway for them at all.
I just want to pick up on that and say that is why when I think about Ann Arbor's, we don't have a lot of land. We're not going to get a hyperscaler in Ann Arbor, right? But I sit in City Hall, and across the street is an AT&T building that is effectively a data center. I mean, it is server rooms, and it's been functioning, just not what we've talked about. What if that became a vertical data center, right? And what if that could be in my zoning that says part of a condition of having that is you have to capture the waste heat and you have to pipe it into a downtown heating district. And so now I've decarbonized heating in my downtown core. Could I have that be a benefit? So I could zone a use that has this additional factors sort of contributed to it, but I can't zone it out completely.
And I noticed one other question about data center location. So while we're on it, I just want to talk a little bit more. Talked about what concerns might there be in terms of physical security of our data, wherever data centers are located. And yeah, if you have the physical building somewhere, you would have, concerns about our data. But a really important thing I want to talk about on data center location is making sure we're not sending them to the same communities that we send lots of other infrastructure, and making sure that it's not just those communities with the least, connected groups or least active groups that are ending up hosting data centers. I think that's a really important thing to consider when we talk about these in Michigan.
Thank you. So we had a couple questions in the chat about the possibility of data centers in space. And apparently the Chinese are currently piloting satellite-based data centers. None of the panelists have discussed satellite-based powered data centers. Is that a plausible possibility?
I'm not aware of the Chinese program. I'd like to hear more about that. My understanding is that there's a lot of people that have talked about that, but it's a matter of feasibility in terms of getting all that hardware up into space. And there's also some physics problems, whereas it's relatively easy to disperse heat when you have an atmosphere to disperse it into. But when you don't have an atmosphere, then you're limited to just radiating that heat out to space, which is a whole other physics problem all by itself. So yeah, probably there's certainly some smart people that are committed to it, but I'm not aware that that's something that's in the immediate short-term horizon.
Thank you. Anyone else? Then I'm going to pose a question from I think it's Charlene Baumgartner, and this is moving in a somewhat different direction. She asks, is it possible to require that all pictures and videos generated by AI be labeled as generated by AI? I mean, obviously, there's going to be a whole world of falsehood created, already is a world of falsehood created through AI. And the question is it possible to somehow restrict that or regulate it?
I can't speak to the, is it actually can we do it in practice? I will say Michigan has enacted laws that political advertisements must have a disclaimer. I recently saw a political advertisement entirely generated by AI, and I was shocked at how short and how not noticeable the disclaimer seemed to be. So I can't really speak to if we can, but I can speak to it has scared me, absolutely.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I think
that should be a legal. I'm sorry, Amanda.
You talk, Peter.
That should be a legal requirement. And again, the path begins in November.
Yeah, just going to say the same thing. I think that, that's the kind of regulation that would make sense with AI, and maybe kind of go to what Missy was talking about I think people would maybe be less likely to use AI if everybody would know that's how they generated something.
Thank you. I should point out that a number of people said that the path to responding to many of these questions responsibly goes through November. That if you believe that, then you should become engaged with the Washtenaw County Democratic Party. We're the group in Washtenaw County that turns out voters, that makes it possible for people who share these concerns to actually get into office. It's a plug for the organization. Well, I'll ask a question, it's especially for Ben, but perhaps others also have something to opine about. You mentioned that the Michigan League of Conservation Voters is developing somebody is developing a data center regulatory statute, that there's a need for that in the state. And you've mentioned a number of states that in various ways provide models for what such a statute can contain, and also standards for negotiation. Because it's quite clear that there's a negotiation process that goes on, and one has to know what exactly to demand from the data centers. That you want to have a list of these are all the things I should ask for. That's kind of been developed over time. Where does such a model statutory exist for Michigan? Is there one? And how about the list that will help communities negotiate or the state negotiate?
Yeah, I think there's a few pieces there. Yes, and some individual legislators are working on different data center regulatory policy, and I encourage everyone to go to Michigan LCV's Action Hub and tell your state legislator that you want a strong data center regulatory bill. I would appreciate, your help in helping me work on that. I'll also say I think the Illinois Power Act is a strong model that legislators and advocates should really be looking at in terms of what pieces can we put out. And then, yes, mentioned in the chat already, but those are the two documents that I send to local communities when they're looking at data centers, which is the Center for Empowering Communities and the Alliance for Great Lakes. Have really good guides for local governments. And what I think is tough is, local governments get those guides and this is what I can renegotiating. I would really love the state to say this is what you will provide to local communities. Yeah.
Anyone else want to chime in on that one?
Ben, can you put some of those links in the chat to your feedback page?
Yeah. And I can also follow up with some of the documents I don't have right on hand that just got dropped in the chat there, but I can make sure that the Washtenaw County Dems have them and they can distribute.
Well, Ben, let me ask, if a local community has been approached by a data center and residents want to know, so what should we ask for? We want to ask for the maximum amount that we can to make sure that we benefit as much as possible. These are very wealthy organizations. They're obviously very eager to locate in Michigan. Tell us, are you prepared to respond to such requests for information? Does Michigan League of Conservation Voters the proper addressee?
I am happy to help, but I will say what you should really be looking at is pausing, is making sure that they are able to develop their local data center, but demanding that the state takes action, right? Until the state takes action, there are things that locals can negotiate and can try to negotiate, but the local governments can't negotiate what Eagle must do and what the MPSC must do. And so I think it is perfectly reasonable to be waiting until the state takes action on some of those concerns. That would be the number one thing I would tell them to negotiate.
Yeah, I want to add to that there are a lot of great guides. I've seen a couple mentioned in the chat for those kind of local ordinances and things that should be asked for. Many of those are the kinds of guides that you can find in the course that we created in our My Community space, which is kind of like a social media away from that Watchful Eyes, a big tech and anybody you might have went to high school with, and where we can talk about climate issues. So great place to join in general, but if you wanted to just find those resources, they're in the very last section of that My Community course on what kind of actions communities can take and what solutions are out there. So I'll link that again.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think communities should definitely, you can ask for a lot because these guys have a lot of resources. The Saline project has given $4 million to local farmland preservation, another $10 million to a local community center in Saline, and I think $8 million to local fire rescue. So the resources are there. They want to contribute because they want to have a positive story to tell, and so the communities have a lot of leverage in asking for what they want.
Thank you. Anyone else care to add to that? I have a question about what will happen if the data center is established and then over time it wants to expand, wants to demand more energy than it originally envisioned. What is the process for that? Do they have to go to the Public Service Commission? And how can they be kind of regulation kind of adapt to that need. So it's a moving target. The data center has gotten permission for a certain amount of gigawatts of energy, and it wants more. Who's in charge?
So those agreements are regulated for a regulated utility, are regulated by the Public Service Commission, and alternates to those agreements would be made at the Public Service Commission.
Okay, thank you. Actually, let me follow up with a question about the Public Service Commission. So Peter showed an interview in which the Public Service Commissioners were very positive about what some data centers might bring to the energy web network in Michigan. Are you as satisfied as they are with the deals they've made?
I would just point to how the Public Service Commission is appointed, and that they're not elected. They're appointed by the same leadership that thought this was a good idea to begin with. So it would be common that they would have a similar view. I also just want to add that your question about wanting to build more, continue to build larger, expand on the campuses they maybe already were approved for. Earlier in the year, Mike had a webinar, and we had an expert from the technology industry who's now retired and worked on data centers for his entire career. His name is Prescott Belk. And he came and he talked to us. And one thing he made very clear is that is just about always how that's the situation goes. The economic boost that a local community sees happens during construction. So there's a lot of reason to want to keep that construction going. And data centers are, it's new technology, and it changes every couple of years. So a lot of the time, by the time this entire campus, we'll say the one in Lyon Township, is 6 buildings over 6 years. That's been agreed to right now. By the time they get that last building built, the first building will be outdated, and they'll need to retrofit it, and they'll start to build on, they'll ask to build on more buildings as well. So just wanted to add those things.
Yeah, I just want to push back a little bit. I think we have exceptional public service commissioners, at least 2 out of the 3, that care a lot and are public servants that are doing an incredible job in a really tough regulatory environment. And it's super easy to demonize them when we don't like what's happening. But most of us don't recognize that they're regulated by our legislature, and their authorities are determined by the legislature. And so I want to give a lot of props to the 2 commissioners that we just saw, who I have very great conversations with and are trying Herculean and a she-Herculean job to move this field forward. And so I would just encourage us to be really cautious about demonizing them.
Yeah, I want to be clear. I wasn't trying to demonize, but to say that they're going to share opinions of the same leaders that helped to pass a lot of the policies that are attracting the same data centers to our state right now. I also added a link in the chat if anybody does want to see just the presentation from the technology executive that I mentioned. You can find it at that link.
Thank you. We have 2 more.
I would like to chime in on the Public Service Commission, if I may.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to say, right, they are creatures of statute and limited in many ways in what they can do by statute, and have a very hard job. I want to point to like two things that are kind of interesting. In many other states, policy has been advanced to try to get the Public Service Commission to adopt large load tariffs. And Michigan's large load tariffs were adopted without a statute directing them to do so, and contain some fairly strong terms. Now, I think there's a lot more that they could do as well, and maybe need more support from the legislature in order to do so. And one point exactly, in a recent data center case, they were talking about the clean energy requirement that is not done by the Public Service Commission, but is put in place by the Strategic Trust Fund Board. And the Public Service Commission said, well, if it was our job, this is how we would make them use clean energy. But unfortunately, it's not our job. And so that's something that we're dealing with here in Michigan.
So Ben, should the Public Service Commission have more powers given to it by the legislature?
the Public Service Commission's power is given to them by the legislature. I think there's a lot of advocates who rightly think the Public Service Commission has more leeway to flex that power than it has in the past. But they also are always, looking to stay very close to statute and not, straight too far from there.
Thank you. We're reaching the end of this program, so we have 5 minutes left. I just want to have maybe a 90 seconds to answer one question from Brian Greminger. What happens if a data center goes bankrupt or fails? So it's all the equipment's out there. What if it can't cover all those agreements that it made? Anyone want to take a stab at that?
I believe that there is a decommissioning requirement for installations like this. I don't have the details on that, but I've been told by some knowledgeable people that exists. And that's pretty typical for things like solar farms and wind farms and stuff like that, it's a standard clause that goes into an ordinance that decommissioning is handled. And then those requirements that I read from the Public Service Commission with sort of minimum payments and penalty payments and things of that nature are some fairly strong incentives for the company to clean up its act if it needs to.
So the money's in escrow somehow. So if the company's bankrupt, it doesn't have enough money to pay all its obligations. And the question is, how can you ensure that the money's going to be there to, clean up the site?
Typically, that's how it's done. And again, I don't have like direct knowledge of what the arrangement is here, but that's typically how it's done on other types of projects, is the money is in some kind of a bond that gets reviewed every 3 to 5 years to make sure it keeps up with inflation, and it's some agreed upon sum that is enough to cover whatever it would take to clean up the site.
All right, thank you very much. At this point, we have 4 minutes left, and I want to give each of the panelists 1 minute for a final remark if they choose to make any parting message for the audience. You don't have to make such a comment, but if you want to, this is your chance.
Well, I did a post on my blog. I'll plug my blog. This is not cool. THINC.blog. I did a post a few weeks ago that just said, "This is your chill pill for data centers. You're welcome." And I think there's been we're absolutely right to be concerned about AI, and we're absolutely right to be outraged about some of the inappropriate misfires that have been done in the name of data centers. There's certainly a lot of room for outrage. But at the same time, we are all using AI, and we're all going to be using more of it. And I think it's worth just what I am seeing is that the technology is changing rapidly enough that these types of really humongous projects, there's a limited demand for those, and beyond this build out that we're seeing right now, I think we're going to see data centers that are much more distributed and a much more modest size, so that we're less likely to be dealing with these kind of very ponderous issues.
Thank you. Amanda, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, first I just want to lift up, I added in the chat, but the kind of bonds Peter was talking about are exact kind of bonds we'd like to see, but we do not have a state law that requires the decommissioning clause quite yet that I know of. So just wanted to lift that up. And then, just final thoughts are that there's a lot of talk, a lot of energy happening, around data centers right now in different communities. And as I've expressed, I think that the primary thing is trust and democracy that we have to deal with, and what say communities actually have, and if residents are being listened to. And I know that it can kind of be frustrating maybe for some people, but I want to give an alternative way of looking at what's happening right now. And I see an incredible opportunity. I see lots of community members, people that have maybe never been involved before, taking civic action, organizing in their communities, getting to know their neighbors that may have a different worldview than they do. And it's really something that is bringing people together. It's building those relationships that help us move people. You have talked about November a lot, right? And anybody that does organizing knows it's all relationship building. And so just think of it, it is an incredible opportunity we have right now. I've done a lot of organizing for a long time, and I've never seen a coalition, I guess, that's quite like the one that's developed around data centers. So, and thank you again for having me.
Thank you for participating. Ben, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I guess I will chime in on we do not have state law on the decommissioning. We do have kind of what Peter was mentioning. When you have a data center that doesn't fulfill its contract, some collateral requirements, and those collateral requirements have been done piecemeal at the MPSC for this service area or for this project, which is why I'll say my biggest thing, we do not have a data center regulatory statute. We really need one. And so hopefully that is something that you all take away from and make sure we have these regulations across the state and don't have these communities competing. And I will say you have an absolutely incredible opportunity to demand this of your current lawmakers, but also of candidates. I think everyone who's here is already a step ahead by being engaged with the Washington Dems. I would say stay engaged with these organizations here on this call and many other great organizations like MEC and the MEJC, doing great work here in the state of Michigan. But most importantly, you're already engaged. Go find 3 other people and make them engaged. That is what I ask of you.
Thank you so much. Teresa Reed points out that this call is actually being joined by people from around the state. So obviously, I'm not asking those not from Washington to get involved in the Washington Democratic Party, but in your county party. And Missy Stoltz.
Yeah, I would say thanks everybody for sitting in the tension, because that's just the reality of this moment, kind of where we're at, and we're finding our way through it. And while we didn't talk a lot about it, I think AI has the possibility to be really powerful and to really help us do innovative things in new spaces, to explore things that we can't even think about. And it also is going to be built on our weaknesses. Our history of racism and prejudice is built into the models, right? It's inherently there. And so I've said the word a lot, critical thinking. It's the thing I really hope that we continue to focus on, is really training these models and being critical with the outputs and thinking intentionally and purposefully and being aware of our history, again, which is what the models are largely predicated on. So it could be a really bright future. It could be a really scary future, and we get to determine which of those is a reality.
Thank you so much. I'd like to give the last word to Teresa Reed. Teresa?
Thank you, Eli, for a great job, and all of you. Ben, thank you for the MLCV's participation in this, our co-sponsorship of it, super important. All of you, Peter and Amanda and Missy, what a fantastic job. Thank you so much. And we will be circulating a set of resources for people who participated in the call, and they'll go on our website. So thank you all very much, and have a beautiful evening. Take care.
Right. The video will be up shortly.
Thanks, Eli.
The video actually has been up all along.